It's my honor to introduce my colleague, Justin Lemiller. As many of you know, Dr. Lemiller is a research fellow with the Kinsey Institute. He is a wonderful collaborator and colleague, and he's actually going to introduce our next speaker. So please give him your attention.
Well, thank you, Justin, and thank you to everyone who had a hand in putting this event together. I know it was a lot of work and many, many months, if not years, of planning. So it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Erick Janssen. Dr. Janssen is a professor at the Institute for Family and Sexuality Studies and the Department of Neurosciences at the University of Leuven in Belgium. He has also worked in various capacities as a Kinsey Institute researcher for more than a quarter century. To date, he has authored more than 140 articles and chapters that collectively have been cited nearly 10,000 times. His body of research has had an indelible impact on the field. It is impossible to do justice to his many scientific contributions in the context of a very short, brief introduction, but one of the things he is most well known for is his work on the dual control model of sexual response, which he introduced with Dr. John Bancroft. This elegant theory has helped us to better understand, as sex researchers, educators, and therapists, individual differences in our propensity for sexual excitation and inhibition. This work has also had a profound public impact as well through its translation in the sexual self-help literature, such as being exemplified in Dr. Emily Nagoski's Come As You Are, among other works. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Erick Janssen to speak about his latest research on the dual control model.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction, Justin. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this celebration. I'm really honored and grateful to be here and to be back. It's been a few years because of the pandemic. And yeah, to me, the Kinsey Institute has a very special place in my heart, had and has currently, and it will always do so. I started as a young scientist here in 1995, when John Bancroft just that year became the director, and he was part of my dissertation committee. I got my PhD that year, and he invited me to join him. I was in Amsterdam, University of Amsterdam, and I thought, well, I didn't know at the time that much about Alfred Kinsey, but I knew the Kinsey Institute, and I knew I had to say yes to this offer. And I thought, okay, I'll do it for a year or two, and then I'll return to Amsterdam. And that became almost 20 years. And I didn't return to Amsterdam, but I live in Belgium now. But the Institute, as you know, and we've already heard a lot about it today. By the way, this is here, so Bev can see the slides. So I don't have to say 120 times, next slide, please. Because that's about how many I have, and this is still the first. The Institute, this is the actual original Kinsey staff, 1948, because behind every great man, there are a lot of other people who were involved. And even then, that was the case. Obviously, over the years, I got to know more about Kinsey himself and his contribution. My respect for him only continues to grow, even though it's been almost 25 years since I started this journey. And of course, Kinsey and the Kinsey Institute would not have existed without the amazing collections that the Institute holds. That's a big part of its history. Kinsey saw everything as data, including art, and everything could be a source, a resource, a source to learn about human sexuality, which made him an amazing person and scientist to think that broadly. This is one of the first staff photos that were taken when I was at the Kinsey, and it's a very special group of people, and several of them you will see again during, if you can see them on the little screens during my presentation. So I've been asked to say a bit more about the dual control model, and that's what I will do. When I thought about it, sort of how can I, because this is a very mixed audience, scientists as well as brilliant lawmakers, lawyers, and journalists. And so I was thinking, okay, some of you who may know about this work have already heard the analogies and the comparisons with brakes and gas pedals, but I was thinking of a photo that I have that I took actually when we still lived in Bloomington, Maxwell Lane and Bryant Park, very close by. We had a beautiful little house there that originally was lived in by Pomeroy and his family, by the way. And one day I was working on an NIH grant, writing in a little study, and I was looking outside, and this is what I saw. And I don't know how well you can see what is going on here, but this was right in front of me. And I don't want to speculate about the gender of these beautiful creatures, but one of them definitely is, my view, high on sexual excitation and low on sexual inhibition, and definitely ignoring all the signs that literally say stop. But seriously, the model, this is the basic idea of the dual control model, that sexual arousal, desire related processes depend on the balance between sexual excitation or the activation of sex and sexual inhibition or the suppression. And that is always a weighing between those processes. And so I'll tell you a bit more about the background, how this come about in a minute. But in addition, well, basically it's what we call a state trait model. The state part of the model is about in every situation, even now, there are potential sexual cues, but there are also triggers and cues that tell us, no, it's not appropriate now to become aroused or to experience certain feelings, definitely not to act upon them. But the trait part of the model is about sort of the fact that we vary in our propensities for those processes. There will be some people in this room that think, why? What's the problem here? Let's have some fun. And why is society so, restrictive in this respect? Well, other people would prefer that I just move on with my talk because they're already getting a little uncomfortable. That is the trait part of the model. We vary in our propensities for both sexual excitation and sexual inhibition. That's the basic idea. Now, how did this come about? This model was developed by me and John Bancroft when he was the director. I moved here in late 95. John and Cindy and family had already moved here that same year from the UK a bit earlier. And we had all kinds of conversations about what should we be doing? What should our research be focusing on the next so many years? And this was one of the starting points of our discussions. My dissertation, I presented the model of sexual arousal. And the basic idea is that when there's a potential sexual cue, stimulus, that's processed by us, and if in our memory systems, hey, this is about sex, then maybe our system gets started up a little bit already. But a lot of my research was done, and John's as well, in men with psychogenic erectile problems. And one of the things that I proposed with this model, and it was based also on research consistent with research of David Barlow and other people, that you need your attention to be in the right place to really get sexually aroused. Now we see a lot of research on mindfulness, etc., but research on attention has been around for quite some time. If your attention is more focused on, well, am I going to be able to get aroused, an erection? If you're concerned, if you're distracted by those thoughts, those are not very sexy thoughts, then you're not going to get very aroused. So your attention has to be with the sexual content of the situation in order to become aroused. If you're somewhere else, if you think about your grocery list or your children, or of course you're not going to get aroused, okay? And so what you just saw was a fancy way of describing a lot of this kind of processes. John looked at this differently. He said, whereas distraction from erotic cues may well be contributory, it's inadequate to explain the often complete failure of erectile response. Most of this research was done in men at the time, by us that is, which occurs in spite of adequate direct physical stimulation. Some other inhibitory mechanism of a more direct physiological nature would appear to be involved. And he based that, I'm a psychologist by training. I did studies in the lab. I used erotica to induce sexual arousal. John did also studies during sleep with, those were the days that differential diagnostics were still considered important. And men with erectile problems, this was pre-Viagra. If the conclusion was that your erectile problem was organic, then it had serious implications for treatment. You might get a prosthesis. So it was important to know whether erections were still possible. And there were various tests, including these nocturnal tests to measure erections during sleep, or tests where a man would get an injection in the penis or smooth muscle relaxant, and that should just lead to an erection if everything locally works. But it didn't always, even in men where it should work. And John said, well, attention doesn't play a role there because it's an injection. There's no sexual situation. So he really thought there's something else happening in certain situations that is direct inhibition. And so we were talking about these things, and that's why the Tudor Room comes in, because that's where we had a lot of our conversations during lunch. I don't know if you can see this quite well. Tudor Room, for those of you who don't know, it is a beautiful lunchroom here. And every time we would show up there also with the whole Kinsey team, and usually people would be very interested in our conversations. And but that's why we talked about these things. And one of the things that happened early on while I, after I arrived here, was that I thought, well, maybe a lot of my research, which I thought was about sexual inhibition, is maybe more about the lack of excitation, processes that interfere with the turning on. If your attention is not in the right place, you're not going to get turned on. That's not necessarily the same as, boom, an active brake that is put on your response possibly because of the threat of, this injection, this needle going towards your penis, for example. That was a nice way to illustrate that, wasn't it? So one of the things that we concluded, should we focus more on inhibition? Should we focus on, we actually really decided, although John was inclined to focus more on research on MPT, etc. I was really the one pushing for, let's keep both of them part of this, and let's study excitation as well as inhibition. And in this, focus on individual variability, which was one of the things that John pushed more for, and at the time, and which was really fascinating because we took this really narrow psychophysiological work on sexual response and broadened it, I think, to actually really look at things that we were inspired by Alfred Kinsey, who obviously, now this is a quote, "The living world is a continuum in each and every one of its aspects. The sooner we learn this concerning human sexual behavior, the sooner we shall reach a sound understanding of the realities of sex." This was really part of our inspiration, that we knew that this is how Kinsey looked at things. And we really thought, well, okay, sexual excitation and inhibition may both be important processes, the weighing of those things, of sexual cues, of potential dangers or threats that may put the brake on it. But let's indeed look at the possibility that people vary a lot in those processes. And that was the starting point of the dual control model. And it started with ideas about how it might work based on psychophysiological and neurophysiological studies, but also basically including a lot of ideas and hypotheses. That was sort of like, this is a starting point for new research. And this I already described, so the state and the trait aspects of this model. And I just want to add, like, okay, sexual excitation is a useful thing to have as a species, that we reproduce. It's okay every now and then to become aroused, which may really assist in that process of reproducing. Sexual inhibition, we considered also as something that is useful to have and adaptive. There are situations where it is maybe better to not be aroused or not to engage in sexual activity. When the ceiling comes down, it might be better, or when the building is on fire, you might just maybe give priority to that. But we also thought, like, okay, maybe high levels of inhibition may make you more vulnerable to develop sexual dysfunctions. There's very little research on more psychological determinants or vulnerabilities for developing sexual problems. Very little. And this was one hypothesis we had. And maybe low inhibition, if your brakes don't work that well, if you stay aroused in situations that are potentially dangerous or risky, maybe you're more likely to engage in risky or continue to engage in risky activity. So we presented this model the first time in '96, the following year, at the International Academy of Sex Research. And we had follow-up publications. John published in '99 a review on inhibition. And he was asked by the editor to describe that model in more detail, and which he had not anticipated. And he offered me to be co-author because of that. But I was still young, naive, and principled. And so I said no, because he had already written the whole review except for that part about a dual control model. Later, I might have responded differently now, because a lot of people say, okay, the dual control model, Bancroft 1999. But that's how history sometimes works. That's okay. I can live with this. I know where the ideas came from. We started with talking about how can we test this with experimental approaches. First thing we decided was, well, we need actually a questionnaire measure to look at that variability, because we can really apply that. We actually use it in research, NIH research, to study sexual risk-taking. And in those days, there was not a whole lot of attention for the fact that a lot of decision-making when it comes to sex happens in the heat of the moment, in a aroused state. And so we felt we could really make a contribution to that research, and we needed a questionnaire measure. And here, by the way, you see David Goodrich, one of our people who was involved in early work in this area, and also later state involved. I'm going to show you quite a few people along. So we had two papers that came in which we presented this new questionnaire. One that is about the questionnaire, the second paper in which we tested its use in predicting sexual responses in the lab. And so the questionnaire was developed by a team of people. In fact, we had discussions about, should we make this questionnaire for men and women, for everybody, or just for men? And I was in favor of doing it for men and women, but I lost the discussion to the rest of the team. And so we decided to only make a version for men, because that's kind of the research where the model came from, was based on. And so we started writing items, questions for this questionnaire about, if this happens, I easily become aroused. If this happens, I lose my arousal, all kinds of possible scenarios. And those were written by, me and John, and Stephanie Sanders, Cindy Graham, and Jenny Bass. And we ended up with over 70 questions that we had. And we had like a number of samples of men who helped us, who filled it out, and we did all our statistics, factor analyses, different types. And basically, the bottom line there is we found not inhibition, excitation statistically, but we found like 10 factors that were relevant to inhibition and excitation. And then we analyzed those again, and we ended up with 3 what's called higher level factors. And one was indeed about sexual excitation, but we found 2 that were relevant to inhibition. And an additional analysis showed that that was pretty solid statistically. I'll describe you a little so you get a sense of what that questionnaire looks like. The sexual excitation scale says 20 questions with 4 of those lower level factors. And there included questions about how easily you become aroused in social settings in response to your own fantasies, but even non-sexual stimuli, like I can easily become aroused just by lying in the sun on the beach. I can turn on. Well, so in the room, you think for yourself, yes, no. Well, that's what individual variability is all about, right? Maybe you think no. But your neighbor may think, oh yeah, that's why I don't go to beaches anymore. This is an example when an attractive person flirts with me, I easily become sexually aroused. And you just indicate to what degree you agree. The first inhibition factor is what we call sexual inhibition due to the threat of performance failure. Doesn't sound very clinical, but it is an attempt to describe what those items are about. It's about not being able to stay aroused unless you're very focused indeed, your sensitivity to distractors, more relevant to what I discussed earlier. This is an example. Also, performance demands related things. If I feel that I'm expected to respond sexually, I have difficulty getting aroused. An example is that. I keep forgetting that the screen may be very small, so I need to make sure that I indeed describe what's on the slides. The second inhibition factor, sexual inhibition due to the threat of performance consequences. So not the threat of performance failure, which I often describe more like a handbrake. You can have sex with a handbrake, you can drive a car with the handbrake on a little bit, but it's going to be more difficult. It's sort of like a tonic level of inhibition or so that has to do with your sexual response system maybe not being as reliable as you would like it to be. Or, sexual inhibition of the second type is more like the brake in a car, the regular foot brake, like you step on it when there's a potential danger, risk, or when you, of course, get to the end of your journey. And that includes sort of like losing your arousal, risk of being caught by others, or negative consequence of sex, or if there's potential for pain for you or your partner, physical or psychologically. And this is an example. If I can be seen by others while having sex, I am unlikely to stay sexually aroused. Here too, you can imagine people will vary. Some people will say, it's the opposite. I love to be seen by others. So that's the questionnaire, the first one that was created. Very important, the correlations between those factors were very low. Sexual inhibition and excitation were not very strongly correlated, which means that they're relatively independent. You can be very high on sexual excitation, easily aroused, but also high on sexual inhibition, easily losing your arousal if something happens. That variability exists. And that has been found over and over again. The second study, actually, because of time, and I have no idea where I am with time, I'm going to skip this other than thank Peter Finn to allow us to test some of the ideas in a lab study. One basic thing I can say about it is that the questionnaire was actually relatively well predictive of responses in the lab. So it was not just that we asked those questions and we can look at how that is associated with answers on other questionnaires. We actually could predict, in this particular case, what you see on this slide, is this was a sample of psychology students, male psychology students who watched various erotic films, but also a rape film, a clip from a regular movie, no nudity, but depicting rape. And men who scored low on CIS2, on the regular break, actually got erections more strongly to that than other men, even when they didn't like what they were seeing. So this was a part of our validation process. Deanna Carpenter, PhD student here. At the time, Cindy was her advisor, Cindy Graham. She modified the questionnaire and tested it in men and women. So there we went a little broader and basically replicated to a large degree the factor structure, those three factors, and again found very low connections or associations between sexual excitation and inhibition, supporting what we had found before. She also looked at, for the scientists among you, this is maybe a bit more interesting than for others, but evidence for support for the divergent and convergent validity, which we had found also in the initial studies. And that basically means this is about the question of to what degree is this specific to sex? Some people have breaks on everything very easily or get very easily activated. Well, over the years, what we're seeing is this is relatively specific to sex. You can be quite inhibited in certain areas of life, but not sexually or the other way. That's basically the bottom line. Another really important message is that variability, which you see here from Diana's study. And more recently, the first representative sample was actually came from Belgium. I was not involved in this study, but you see the distribution of the scores on these slides, and it's all there. People score in the middle, very high. All our studies, we find, for example, that 1/3 or so of women score much higher on sexual excitation than more than half of all the men, right? So an important message here is, and this comes up with many things when we compare, especially men and women in sexuality areas, is that men may masturbate more, men may have more fantasies. That's statistically shown to be different on average. I think personally that we're focusing way too much on those kind of differences, average differences, because the variability among men and among women is at least 10 times that size and compared to the average difference between men and women. I think it's a very important message of the model that there's variability. And variation means it's good, but it also may make some subpopulations, subgroups of people more likely to do or engage in certain types of behaviors. I'll get back to that. Diana also was involved in creating a shorter version, a 14-item questionnaire, which, by the way, as it happens, here Elizabeth Bernstein, journalist for the Wall Street Journal. And right now, today, you can go to the website. There's a beautiful piece about the 75th anniversary. It's right now available, only since a few hours. And but as part of that, she was nice enough to put a link to the 14-item CSS questionnaire, so everybody can actually fill it out, and you get feedback on your scores and also some explanation about what they mean. Data is not collected. So I will get back sort of implications for sexual desire, sexual dysfunction, and risky sexual behavior. The sort of assumptions that we started the research with. I will get back to that in a minute. But first, I just want to say the model was really well received right away. And we actually won some awards for the Hugo Weigel Award for those questionnaire papers. Was my second one because I won also Hugo Weigel Awards for my model that I showed at the beginning. It was there for a reason, of course, included in those slides. And the Hugo Weigel Award is the award for best publication of the year in the Journal of Sex Research. And Diana also won an award for her paper, which was the Reese Theory Award. And online, you could see references to it, and still people have columns and apply it in various ways. Talks, even I found a number of YouTube videos with students explaining to their friends what the dual control model is about. And one student, you probably barely see it, but she's in the upper left corner, Emily Nagoski. Justin already mentioned her earlier. It was also a PhD student with us, by the way. She got a PhD here at Indiana University. I was co-advisor of her work, and she did her dissertation on the dual control model, by the way. And she wrote me a few years later, I have the email still. Erick, if you're not gonna write a book about the dual control model, I will. And she did. And it became this book, Come As You Are. And it's not just about the dual control model, but that started it for her. She was so enthusiastic about the model that she really felt, I'm gonna write this book if you're not gonna. I'm gonna catch up, and I'm working on it, but it's been, not sure if it's gonna catch on as much as hers. And the New York Times, even back then, had a piece in which they already talked about the gas pedals and the brakes to explain the model. That was very nice. So we got a lot of positive feedback and attention for the model. In the meantime, Stephanie Sanders, Cindy Graham, and others started thinking about, oh, nice and interesting, but this questionnaire that we developed for men, is that really going to get as well to the mechanisms and processes that we think may be relevant in women? And so they did a focus group study in women to talk about factors that may turn you on and factors that may turn you off in the real world, in real life. What I found very interesting is that we didn't do that for men. Men are simple. We start writing questions for them. 3 women and 2 men. Women? No, let's talk first. Robin Milhausen, another PhD from Indiana University, was a co-author of that work, as well as, and actually here you see her with Deanna Carpenter and Emily Nagoski, all here right in front of Morrison Hall. And Kim McBride was also a PhD student here, also involved in that focus group work. But I talked with Bill Yarber, who's sitting right there, and we really thought, well, maybe after the fact that we're going to do a focus group study on men too. And we did. And there was really some overlap in findings. It was really a nice set of studies, and actually it's one of the studies that I'm most proud of. Still, I'm known as an experimentalist and empirical, but that focus group study was really extremely rewarding to have groups of men, like 10, 15 men from all over Bloomington, a homeless person right next to a lawyer, and they all started like this. And after 15 minutes, they were talking about penises and how irrelevant they might or might not be to their experience of sexual arousal. It was really, I learned a lot from it. It was fascinating. So a lot of people were involved with those focus groups. Bill Yarber, Scott Butler, Kim McBride, Brennan Hill. You can probably not see them, but they're in those photos. And so a lot of people were involved in the early work of this, the dual control model. And so Stephanie, Cindy, Robin created a new questionnaire on the basis of those their focus group, a new questionnaire for women. But they also kind of used the findings of the male focus group to support the modification of that questionnaire so it could be used in men as well. So it was a nice tandem of studies. I'm not going to go too deep into the new questionnaire, partly because of time, but I do want to point out, so they found in original analysis 8 factors. We found 10 with men, they found 8 with women, and did higher level analyses and found basically a grouping indeed of some that were more relevant to inhibition, some more relevant to excitation. But what was also an interesting distinction is that for the man in the early work, we tried to stay as close as possible to the model of inhibition, excitation. Yes, we had 2 inhibition factors, but instead of saying like, let's keep working with those 10 factors that we initially found. For the women's studies, there was actually more of an emphasis, like let's keep working with those 8, and sorry, this is the one from the questionnaire that is for women and men, WM, the 6 factors that came out of those analyses. So there was more focus on the sort of the complexity of those processes and looking at all those factors instead of just sexual inhibition, excitation, although some studies actually did report those higher level scores of the combination of all this. Maybe too much detail. Another graduate from Indiana University, Kristen Jakowski, also tested the new questionnaire in a more diverse sample in terms of sexual orientation. So the last review of the Kinsey, I mean, this is where it all started, of the Kinsey questionnaires and how they have been applied, was published in 2009 by us. Other people have actually written overview papers as well. I am working right now on a new review, and lo and behold, it is really nice to see how many people are using the model in their research. A lot of, I mean, how many references might there be in the literature to Masters and Johnson? Thousands. How many replications? How many people have replicated Kinsey's work? Yes, there are national representative surveys, but with like 16, 18,000 oral interviews, right? So the dual control model is actually really being tested and explored by people, and that's really great to see, I think. So in the initial review, we had like 20 plus papers that we could talk about. Over the past 10 years or so, there have been more than 150 publications with the dual control model, empirical papers, and most of them not done by us. And there's translations, which is great as well. So there's the questionnaires, the various questionnaires have been translated in total into 13 other languages, from French to even several South Asian languages. And over around 13 of these studies did all the statistics, like in Portugal and in Spain and in Germany, to see if the structure is holding up. And it is. So that's replication. There's variation. There's variation in all kinds of statistical, more technical aspects of the number of specific those factors. But the higher level factors of sexual inhibition and excitation for the new questionnaire, or the 3 factors from the original questionnaire, the 2 inhibition, that keeps coming back in other countries. So that's, I think, pretty nice. Okay, I will tell you a little bit. Okay, so you have this model, you've been advertising it really nicely so far. What did you find beyond that variability and those factors? So the number of studies have, including our own early ones, have focused on sexual dysfunction, whether or not high inhibition might be associated with a higher vulnerability to developing sexual problems, for example, and whether if your brakes don't work as well, you might be someone who's more likely to engage in various forms of risky sex. But with everything I'm talking about today, and definitely following next, we could talk for hours about what it all is that we're talking about. What is sexual dysfunction? What is sexual risk-taking? I'm very aware of that, especially also when I go in the direction of hypersexuality or sex addiction, and right? But there is a literature out there. I cannot just summarize 150 papers in the remaining time we have. So bear with me, and please forgive me for generalizations and things that you think, well, the world is more complex than what you're now saying. I'm very aware of that. Increasingly, so initially that work started with a focus on sexual dysfunction and risk-taking. Now we see more and more research on applying it to things like sex addiction or sexual compulsivity, or what I would summarize as hypersexuality, asexuality, and more also sexual aggression. The model may be relevant. So sexual dysfunction, sexual inhibition, especially that handbrake type, is in all studies indeed very strongly associated with self-reported sexual problems, mainly especially related to sexual arousal or erections. In some studies also sexual excitation is relevant to that. But most of the time when it is connected to sexual desire, problems with sexual desire. So I'm gonna, if I would just try and summarize it simpler terms, is that we have identified different putative neurophysiological systems, inhibition, excitation, which indeed can be separate, but they also seem to predict different things. Sexual excitation is particularly relevant to predicting levels of sexual desire, your arousal in the lab overall, how many partners you may have had, but it doesn't predict how risky you were in terms of like condom use, yes or no, with all those partners. That is predicted by inhibition. Most studies, jumping ahead a bit, but even when it comes to sexual aggression, there's a mix of influences, but quite often it's not necessarily sexual excitation that's the strongest predictor. You might think, okay, especially some men, we mainly think of men when it comes to sexual aggression, and the data supports that, who are very sexual, who want sex all the time, everywhere. They may be, I can tell you, they're going to score very high on sexual excitation. That is not necessarily the best predictor of the transgression of sexual or personal space or of sexual aggression. It is inhibition. It's not whether or not you become very easily aroused. It is whether or not the brake goes on, where you're in situations where maybe that is not very nice or good or appropriate. So I'm actually summing up quite a few slides this way, just to focus more on the bottom line there. So risky sexual behavior, sexual inhibition is relevant there, and mainly of that second type. I have to add there that the new questionnaire doesn't have as clear a factor relevant to what we looked at in sexual inhibition 2 or CIS2, which is more responsive to all kinds of different threats. There are similar factors in the newer questionnaire, but more of those in inhibition processes are relevant to the partner or relationship context. So many of those studies actually use the original questionnaire, the CIS, because of it having that specific CIS2 factor. Hypersexuality, more than 30 studies have been done on that topic. Some will have in the title sex addiction, some will have in the title sexual compulsivity. And almost all of them actually use the CIS questionnaire. And there too, it's sexual excitation that's the most important predictor. How easily you become aroused is very much connected to things like not feeling in control of sexual thoughts, sexual fantasies, your desire to masturbate, to look at porn, etc. Although some studies have found also impact of the other factors. And the most intriguing thing, I don't have time to talk about this much, but we now also see that handbrake is playing, or that's actually to me one of the most surprising things across all those studies, is that CIS1, that handbrake type of inhibition related to the threat of performance failure, is predictive of sexual risk taking, hypersexuality in some cases, and sexual aggression sometimes. What to make of that? I'm not entirely sure. One way to look at it could be that some people may engage in certain types of behaviors to overcome this kind of the handbrake being on a bit while they're driving. So it's just one way. I don't know if that makes sense the way I describe that, but that sometimes you may do certain things to actually help you become aroused because you're actually having more difficulty becoming aroused. It's not on the sexual excitation side, but because that little handbrake might be on. It's showing up in the studies. I can't help it. But it is intriguing and something to think about. We have one study that we did ourselves recently, and there's another, one of our graduates involved with that. This was published only 2 years ago. Probably the largest study on hypersexuality or in men who have sex with men. We had over 200 men come to the lab. And this was a project together with Mike Miner and Eli Coleman in Minnesota. And Nikki helped us do very advanced and fancy analyses, because what we found was that those men's responses in the lab to porn, their erections to porn, we did not predict. There's a whole discussion about this in the empirical literature. Was not predicted by their porn use, which is what some people think, that if you watch a lot of porn, you will have more difficulty becoming aroused in other settings. It was not predicted by their hypersexuality scores. Their responses in the lab were predicted by sexual excitation scores. Really interesting. And there you see Nikki actually in the whole context of where that picture came from. Asexuality, in terms of dual control model, low excitation, not as much related to inhibition. Sexual aggression, another graduate, Zoe Peterson, now a professor here. See, several people, of course, leave the Kinsey and come back. Justin, you have my email. Zoe Peterson and we were involved in a study together in which we found that in particular sexual inhibition, as I mentioned earlier, was the strongest predictor of self-reported sexual aggression by young men. So all kinds of behaviors that they engaged in that we could predict with the dual control model. We're also working together on a new project. I have a new PhD project in Belgium on sexual aggression, where we're going to dig deeper into the dual control model as a potential explanation for some people's behaviors. I was going to say men. This project, we actually focus specifically on self-identified heterosexual men, a lot of them students. The literature is really increasingly showing that prevention programs are not effective at universities. You know, Obama and the administration told all universities in the country to come up with prevention programs, but there was not much of a theoretical or other basis for it, if you ask me. I'm being very blunt and direct about this, but the review articles, the meta-analyses, they just don't show much effectiveness. And one of the things that is now in the literature that you can see a lot is discussion about, yeah, but maybe we should not think that all types of behaviors or types of men, which is mainly about men, mainly about heterosexual men, that they're all the same. And that the mechanisms, the things that the determinants are the same for everyone. So there's almost a bit of a call for more research on typologies or you know, process. And so we're stepping into that discussion by looking at also the role of dual control model, which may be more relevant in some situations and some men than in others, where other personality related you know, factors can play a role. Anyway, we're exploring all of that, and Zoe is involved in that project as well. So I want to end. Honestly, how am I on time? We started a bit later. I hope I still have a few minutes. Put it in an email. So there's a lot of, there's also increasingly research on the neurophysiology and experimental studies. I'm not going to go into that. I just want to end with, I think, the theoretical impact that the model has had, and also clinical aspects or applications. So incentive motivation theory is, in my view, the most dominant and prominent way of a theoretical perspective on sexual motivation currently. We went from the drive theory notions that Freud made very famous to, you know, sex is a force that comes from within and that is unstoppable. And if you don't do something with it, something will go wrong with you. To incentive motivation that is much more sensitive to the role of our external world and of stimuli, triggers. It is, I think, the most dominant and influential and also most sensible way of looking at sexual motivation. Well, Singer and Totes introduced this many years ago, but Fred Totes introduced an update of that theory a number of years ago, in which he explicitly also gives a place to sexual excitation and inhibition. Nice to see that we inspired people to also include it more in their theoretical thinking. Clinical applications, there are several papers now where written by others where they talk about the potential relevance of dual control model applied clinically. But you also see it like in flibanserin, this pink Viagra. Apart from the question of whether or not this is a good development to begin with, and I am not in favor of medicalization of sexuality and sexual problems, but it is an example of what is happening, and that is that that was originally at least sold in that scientifically on the basis of the idea that low sexual desire as a clinical problem in women, that's what they focus on with pink Viagra, of course, is that there would be a disbalance between excitation and inhibition that needs to be fixed, of course. Well, flibanserin doesn't really work, but it is being sold anyway. Though that's a whole different discussion. But it is interesting to see how the dual control model has become part of that sort of developments as well. There's another one. This is a series of 3 papers that were published a number of years ago where they used the dual control model also to think more about different medical therapies. And a Dutch company actually came up with drugs Librido and Libridos for women And those would be medical drugs that can help you if the problem is that you're too high on inhibition or maybe too low on the excitation part. So again, apart from what we make of those types of drug developments, it is interesting to see that the dual control model is more part of at least a more sophisticated way of looking at sexual response, and that it's not just something including desire that is activated or not, but that you really, and what I hear the most, and I get emails from clinicians clinical psychologists and others and sex therapists saying that the model already just helps in talking with clients about their sexual problems. And also in partner and couple relationship contexts, what is going wrong? Are you not really getting everything you need in terms of stimulation, or are other things actually suppressing it? And maybe there's nothing wrong with what is happening sexually in terms of sexual behavior, but other factors may be suppressing it. So it is changing, it has changed to some degree the way clinically and otherwise sexual problems are thought about and treated. And you see, this is another example of papers where it's also being applied to possibly like hypersexuality, sexual. Okay, some concluding thoughts. The dual control model has held up pretty well in terms of the questionnaire part, the trait part, those individual differences, and that those factors are relatively independent in different studies, in different countries, and different languages. That they're relatively independent comes up all the time. The individual variability, that is really substantial in those processes. That if you're very high on sexual excitation, you probably are a more sexual person. You think about sex more often, you masturbate more often, you want more sex also with other people. Your desire levels are higher. Many studies show that it really is almost a very strong basis for high desire. If you're very low on it, sex is maybe not as much on the map for you. It doesn't get all activated that easily. It's okay, we're all different. But it may also make you more vulnerable in certain contexts. So part of the message is know thyself. I think more research is needed on not just looking at those factors separately, but actually how they interact. The combination of what I said at the beginning, you might be high on this and low on that. There's not much research actually looking at those combinations. There's not enough research on actually the state part. I mean, all the studies that I looked at use the questionnaire, the questionnaires. I use one of the questionnaires. But the weighing in every situation, of course, you need very clever and creative designs to look at that. The underlying neurophysiology, there's a lot of research on the physiology and brain physiology when it comes to sex in general, but there's not a whole lot of connection directly with ideas like that of the dual control model. Developmental aspects, so how does this all come about? Can we change those things? Is it stable for your whole life? There's some longitudinal studies, but most of them are like 4 years at best, which are interesting, but there's a lot of room to learn more about. You see the same in the literature on attachment, attachment styles. Initially, there was sort of something like you were raised, or your caregivers had a major impact how safe you feel in the world, right? Attachment theory. And that can impact you for the rest of your life. Now there's more and more research on relationships may have an impact on your attachment and may actually change that. Well, similar questions you could ask, obviously, about the dual control model. And then, CIS-1, that handbrake and what that does in terms of certain behaviors, the plot thickens. We need more. So onwards and upwards. I wanted to just show you this picture because John Bancroft couldn't be here, unfortunately. He's in the UK with his son Jack, who's who is by now a young man, not the young little boy that you see in this photo. I love this photo because it looks very affectionate, very nice. So, but he sends his greetings, and of course, onwards and upwards also applies to the Institute in general. That's where this model was born, and it was supported. I more than 25 Kinsey affiliated people have been involved with research on the model in some way or another, as grad students or later or both. And I think that it's really special. I don't know if there are many other projects or themes within the Institute where so many people over the years actually were involved in. So I wish everyone, well, a great future, including the Institute and all my beloved colleagues and friends.